Hello everybody, can you hear me well? Yeah? Okay, cool. So today we're gonna talk about Fallout and some slow motion war simulation, couple of breakdowns here. So let's get started. I'd like to introduce myself first. My name is Lucas Stringhetti. I've been working on this industry for around 6 years. I'm originally from Brazil, and has been 3 years I'm working at Framestore. And I need to thank Framestore to bringing me here and to all the support they gave me, and also, of course, Side Effects for hosting this amazing event and for the invitation. I also need to thank these people. They were super important for me, and they always supported me. I'm a very lucky person to be able to learn from them. I'll start with João Cita. He was the VFX supervisor on Fallout. Phoenix Lee, he was the effects lead on Fallout. And Diamond Wheeler, he wasn't work on Fallout, but he helped me a lot with the setup we're going to talk today and with this very presentation. And of course, for the best department at Framestore, the FX department, these guys are the best. Cool. I have just a question for you, just for fun. Who here watched Fallout? Okay, cool, good to see. Nice. I think you're gonna like it. Thank you very much. So let's start with some numbers here. I would like to bring some statistics from this show. So at Framestore, we did 6 sequences in total, 120 shots, more than 4,000 tasks, 25,000 versions were produced, more than 2 million frames were generated. We had 20 water shots in total, and around 600 hours of flip simulation. All right, what we're gonna talk today here? Well, it's gonna be mostly about this shot. And I divided in a couple topics here to make it easier. So we're gonna start with references, then we're gonna talk about timescale, the effects workflow, and from this moment on, we're gonna dive a little bit deeper into the setup. So we're going to talk about water simulation, the data compression, the mesh, the extension of the mesh, and exporting it. So let's get started. Well, references. Usually it's a very important part of our work to make sure the director and the artist are on the same page, so we are not wasting time and until they decide to change. But it's always good to have good reference to start our work. On this show, I would say was a little bit more important than normal because the reference was always and was also the footage, the plate that we're going to use. So I was able to see those details, and my mission was to match that, to be able to blend the CG and the plate. And also, because the director of this series was Jonathan Nolan, and he's a director that always liked to have something real on the screen. So I brought a footage from him, a quote from him here. So where he says, the more reality you can bring to bear in front of the camera, the more immersive it is for the audience. So I had two footage that I could use. That was the first one, and that's the main one. So my mission was to see those splashes, the amount of droplets, the speed, the timing, and match it. Talking about timing, then we can talk about timescale. There is no way to talk about slow motion shot without touching the timescale subject. So that was how fast everything happened in real life. And that was the footage, that the speed we have to delivery. Using the data, the metadata from the camera, we were able to find out the magical number that was 1/6 of the real speed. So it was 6 times lower than the real speed. Well, now you might be thinking, we just grab this number, put into the time scale, and it's done, right? Well, kinda, yeah. But there is a couple things that we need to explain here. When we change the time scale into the solver, it only be applied to wherever is inside the solver, inside the DOP, not for the emissions, for the collisions, any kind of source you're inject into it. So we need to balance the velocity before that. So I did a simple example here to try to explain that. So I have this feet kicking our loved rubber toy here in a normal speed, and that is the simulation. Amazing, right? So let's imagine the velocity was 2 here. So after the simulation, we can retime it. On this case, I'm retiming 10 times. So 10 times is lower than the original one. So that will be the result of it. That's a valid solution for slow motion shots where you can post-sim retimer. This next example is gonna be using the feed in slow motion already, and the time scale is gonna be set to time to 0.1. Since the animation is in slow motion, the velocity is gonna be in slow motion as well. So it kind of fails because we don't have enough velocity and the time scale is set to 0.1. We need to balance the velocity. To do that, we multiply by the inverse of time scale before the solver. So we get similar results. So comparing both should be exactly the same. I'd just like to bring this for you, this kind of formula to always keep in mind when working with different time scale. Let's talk about the workflow I did on this shot. So initially, we need to prep our assets. On this case, we only have Gooper as an asset. We need to make it as efficient as possible to save time. So originally, the full size of it was 124 megabytes, and I was able to reduce to 5.6 megabytes, just chipping it and keeping the resolution whatever we need. So it's 95.5% smaller. Next step would be the source and collision. You're using the wave tank, the ocean source. We have a bounding box, the water level, the emission is going to be there. Next step would be water simulation. That's the result of it. We had 139 frames on this shot. The simulation time was 44 minutes, around 3 frames a minute. After that, we need to generate a mesh from those points, extend this mesh, export that, and that's the final result of it. Another element was spray that relies on the water simulation and the base mesh. That's how the source looks of the spray. And that's a good timing to remember again that we had to balance the velocity because we just saw the source was also in slow motion. And that was the final result from the simulation for the spray. Another element was dripping. That is just to add a little bit more complexity into the slow motion feeling, where the idea was to have some droplets falling from him while he's jumping. And if we combine those two elements, that's the render from those two elements together. Another element by its own, it's the mist element, just to blend everything together using pyro simulation here. And another element is droplets. This one was basically to fill the gap between the plate and the CG. I was trying to match the droplet scale and the timing of it. And this is all the elements we had separately. All right. So this is the overall setup. Just browsing around just to show, show off my organization. It's paying off today, finally. All right. So from now on, I'd like to discuss with you a little bit deeper into the setup about these topics here. But while we still have this on the screen, I would just like to bring your attention to the water simulation itself, because this is kind of the center of the entire setup. Here we are able to set the start frame, the time scale, the particle separation, and everything is going to be related to that, link it to those attributes. So we could use this setup not only for slow motion shots, but a bunch of situations that we need to use water. Let's get started with the water simulation. So that's how it looks inside the DOP. I'd like to talk about those nodes here. Let's start with PT density. What is PT density? Well, in summary, this is just an attribute that we're gonna create, and that's gonna represent if that point is in a dense area or in a sparse area. I did a simple example here to demonstrate that. So this is a sphere with a bunch of points inside, and we're scaling it up and down. The first step will be to convert into volumes. So naturally, if the points are closer to each other, the density is going to be higher. By the way, I'm using the volume rasterized particles to do that. And the process is, after the volume, we're gonna use the points again to read back the density of the volume using the volume sample function. And after that, we just have a color to visualize it. Another similar example to do the kind of the same thing would be using the PC find function, where each point is gonna search for its surrounding points. And depending on the amount of points found, we're gonna have the representation of the density. But on my test, this method was around 20% slower than the first one. So here is a cache from the simulation itself, applying the first method again, just to visualize how it works. So we can see we're sampling the volume back to the points, and that is gonna give us the value we want. Okay, right now it's just an attribute. It's doing nothing, right? Also, this technique can be used for a bunch of things, right? It doesn't need to be only for flip simulation. It can be used in vellum, can be used in grains, on pop simulation. The only pre-requirement is you need to have points. Cool. On this case, we're gonna use on a bunch of things we're gonna show you today, but initially we can use for pop drag, for example, where we can vary the intensity of the pop drag, the air resistance, depending on the density. So we're gonna fit the value, and on higher PT density, it's gonna be a lower air resistance, and a lower PT density is gonna be a higher air resistance. Another note here was the pop force, to break up a little bit the motion. But we can't just apply the pop force everywhere, otherwise it's gonna be a little bit too noisy, and the surface is gonna be affected as well. It's gonna look artificial. So we need to filter that, where we're gonna apply it. To do that, we need to create a mask. To do the mask, I'm using 3 things here. First, height. I'm gonna filter by height using the reference, the water level as a reference. The second thing is gonna be the character. We're gonna transform that into density. And if the point gets too close to the character, we're gonna reduce the intensity of the pop force. And third, the PT density again, to break up. So the intensity of the pop force is gonna vary depending on the density of the point as well. The last thing I'd like to talk here is the extra source. We know when the supervisor asks you to, he liked everything, but he wants to add just a couple things more. So in this case, I will ask to add some points, a little bit more droplets, and instead of everything going upwards, that's naturally from the simulation itself, and avoiding to change the pre-roll to get more particles, I just, create a simple solution, if I could, to try to add this variation here. And I just add those points without any velocity. That is the final result of the simulation. And that's the cut range we delivered. All right. We know this kind of simulations can be expensive, meaning data-wise and the size of the data. So it's a good opportunity for us to talk about data compression. Let's take this frame, for example. The size of it was 264 megabytes. If we apply the fluid compress up, we're able to reduce 51%. If we do the method I'm going to show today, we can reduce even more, to 90 megabytes, 30% smaller than the fluid compress up. That means 66% smaller than the original no compression cache. So what we can do? Well, the usual things first. We can delete all the attributes we don't need. We can promote p-scale to details. Not only p-scale, but we can promote all the attributes that are uniform. We can set the precision to 16 bits if we don't need a lot of precision. We can delete all the points outside the frame, and I guess that's the most important one. We can use convert VDB points. So basically each voxel is gonna represent 32 points. The only downside, if I may to say, is we need to decompress that after the cache, but that's okay. And when we can resize the velocity field, on this case, I'm reducing by half the resolution of the column. All right, we get the simulation. The output from the simulation is 3 things: particles, VDB surface, and the VDB velocity field. Let's start with the particles. We have p-scale that we can play with a little bit. So let's use again the PT density to break up the p-scale. So points that are a little bit sparser, we can multiply to be a little bit smaller so we can have a very nice, fine, detailed droplets there. The next step would be converting VDB to particles. That's how usually we start to create the mesh. We grab the particle separation and we apply into the voxel size, and the radius is set to 1 here. On my test, I was able to get a better results if I reduce the voxel size by half and the radius scale to 0.6. So I was able to get a better matching with the reference I had. Next step, VDB surface. The idea of this element is to have just a big chunk of water, just the base of it. So the first step will be reshaping it. We're going to erode it, reducing all the tiny points. The second thing would be using the VDB segment by connectivity. If you never use it, it's similar to the connectivity SOP, but for VDB. It creates a list for us with all the VDBs it finds, and the surface 0 is always the biggest one. So we're going to keep everything. We're going to delete everything but the surface 0. All right, then we combine both into this beautiful mesh. But since we reduce the P-scale, the surface of it has a lot of imperfections, a lot of details there that we kind of don't need right now. We need to smooth the surface, but we can't smooth everything because we're gonna lose all the beautiful details we got from the splashes. So we need to mask the area we need to apply the smooth. We're gonna use the velocity field to do that. And that's the result before and after. It's good to point out that the mask is inverted here. And that's just a turnaround of the mesh, final mesh, just to show the amount of details we got from it. Now that we have this base mesh, we need to extend it. First step would be to separate, to get the edge of it. I'm using the original bounding box clipping just to keep it on the surface and transferring color to the edge of it. I'm using this attribute to flatten that area. Parallel to that, we're gonna expand that another box using the same height, and we're gonna combine both. Next step would be selecting just the surface of it and blasting everything else. So we're gonna have this beautiful surface here. We're getting close to the final. We need to export that. Before to do that, we need to do a couple things before. So we need to add detail on this surface. We just make sure it was flat and smooth. So let's add details. To do that, we're gonna use the ocean spectrum and the ocean evaluate, where we can just plug the first input is gonna be the extended mesh, the second input is gonna be the points and the VDB, they're gonna receive the spectrum. If you do that, we're gonna have this nice noise from the ocean evaluate, but it's gonna be applied everywhere. We need again to filter, to mask the area that we need. We're gonna use this amazing node called particle fluid mask. The idea is similar to what we did for the smooth. So the first input is gonna be points and the VDB, and the third input is gonna be the ocean spectrum. The output something like this. We're gonna feed that into the ocean evaluate when we're gonna be able to remove the noise from all these splashes. Also, it's good to keep in mind that the output from the ocean evaluate, at least on this version of the Houdini, version 19, the output of it kills the velocity you're applying all the velocity you are inputting from the extended mesh, and the output of it is just the velocity from the noise that is generating. What is amazing, but we need to add the velocity back into the mesh. Since the topology is the same, we can just, use this expression here. And finally, we need to export an attribute for lighting to be able to blend between two shaders. At Framestore, we use a proprietary render engine called Freak. So we can't rely on the Mantra or Karma to do the real-time processing for this attribute. We need to bake this attribute into the mesh. And that's the output from the render. So we can see that we have the clear water as a shader, and we're blending using the vorticity to this other shader that it's kind of white water, bubbly feeling. Here is a clip showing the transition between only footage, only CG, and the blending of all the elements together. And that was how we did this shot. Just like to thank again Framestore and Side Effects. And of course, you guys for your attention and for your time. Thank you very much. Thank you. Any questions?
Hey, great shot, by the way. Thank you. Did you have to simulate any laminar flow of water on the surface of the character? Was it a requirement, or was pretty much like hidden?
Sorry, a flow?
Like a laminar flow, like just water on the surface of the character that is like running on the surface of the character and dripping off.
I see what you mean, like droplets or something like that. On this shot, no. I just had the droplets falling, but we had a couple situations that we had to have some droplets attached to the surface and slide on the surface, but not on this shot. Wasn't that close.
Oh, awesome.
Can you please talk a little more on how you use the velocity field to mask your smoothing of the mesh? Was it like, how did you do this?
So the velocity field is a vector. The idea is to convert that into a float, a scalar field, and that we can use as a mask. On this case, we were using the analytics to convert, and also using the curl option. So we have two volumes combined into one, the left and the curl combined into one volume that is a scalar. So we're using that as a smooth.
That's cool, thank you. And also, just maybe a couple of words on how did you do the secondary droplet simulation? Did you use the velocity field from the original flip? And what did you use for the source of those droplets?
You mean the spray or the dripping?
No, you mentioned that you had these flying droplets that were a separate layer.
The element by itself.
Yeah.
No, just a flip simulation, just randomly scattering a couple spheres and converting to points. Nothing fancy, to be honest. Very.
Oh, so it wasn't even connected to the original flip.
No, it's
just something.
Element by its own. To be honest, I used the same cache on 3 shots.
That's cool. Thanks again. Great work.
Thank you.
That's actually all the time we have questions for, guys. Sorry. Thank you very much, Lucas.
Thank you, guys.